Hey everybody, welcome back to Contest Prep University. Joe Klemczewski with Adam Atkinson. We're going to talk about, of course, hydration on contest day. Probably fills up about 25 to 30% of our space on this podcast, Adam. But the reason I wanted to try to even get a little bit more granular is I not only talk to a lot of people about this and have for 25 plus years in articles and vlogs and blogs and so forth. Um, but even just trying to convince my own clients week to week why we're doing what we're doing, how it's going to impact your look, it just never ceases to amaze me how many people have such a difficult time understanding the concept. So when you think of contest day, I think it's most important for a competitor, especially one who may not have all of the physiological knowledge that they could regarding the topic. Start thinking back to the day before the contest, 2 days before, 3 days before, a week before, 2 weeks before. You can't get too far into the off season or you just have, probably too much body fat to really see the difference. But all of those days, let's say your body composition is nearly stage ready. So 2 weeks before the contest, prior to any manipulative changes during peak week. And you have good days and bad days in the gym. Some days you look a little softer, some days you look a little fuller, some days you look a little tighter, a little more vascular. And I just would like people to start noting where their hydration levels are. So I have a handful of recent clients and their representative looks and comparisons on contest day to what I'm describing, how they look prior, that I want to roll through. But I'm curious because this is something you and I don't talk about on a weekly or even monthly basis, but we all have different methods. I'm sure you do things slightly different than I, and we have a range of coaching tactics. Sometimes we would do something different for this client versus this client versus this client for this division compared to that division. So, if you don't mind, just kind of summarize where you are with stage hydration, contest day hydration. What is your overall goal and how do you get there?
Yeah. So what I've been doing recently with my clients, and this is with a lot of trial and error and what has worked best. I think the thing that we deal with the most as coaches is show timing predictability. And that is always the hardest thing. So I usually time my clients' water intake close to show start or about an hour into the show. And I almost use that water cutoff. And I'll call it a cutoff because I want them to have a certain amount by the time that they drink that water. And essentially, what we do with that is I use that as an additional check in. Let's see how you look. I might even do something called a test pump up there. I say test because I don't want people to go ahead and start their pump up at 10 o'clock, at 10 o'clock show until their class is on. And then they're taking notes on how did their pump feel? Did they feel like they couldn't get a pump? Were they flat? And also just another chance to communicate. Maybe they look full, but they're not vascular. Is the venue cold? I can start taking notes on a lot of other things. So recently, that's been working really well for me. It gives them a goal. I used to do it by ounces per meal, and I think that works well too. I did that for a long time, but what I ran into with that is I felt like people would either be a little bit behind, or if I gave them ounces around their makeup appointment, they would not drink at the times they were supposed to. So it was easier just to, from the start of the morning to this point, I want you to have this much in.
So I'm gonna go through just a step or two back into peak week to make sure people are catching up. Because I remember distinctly over the last couple of weeks, some clients asking me this. Even despite what they may or may not know about me and methodologies that I teach, they ask, "So when are we going to start cutting water?" And of course, we don't. Well, what about Friday? Don't we want a little bit less? Like, can you go too far Friday? You literally wake up every morning dehydrated. That's just a physiological fact. Whatever you have consumed in water or liquids the day before, you will most certainly have urinated out that night, maybe during the night, and as soon as you wake up in the morning. And through respiration, you have been losing tons of hydration. So you will never be more dehydrated than when you wake up. I don't care how much you drank the day before. You could have had 3 gallons of water the day before the contest. You're going to wake up with the exact same of water in your body as you did the morning prior because you used that water. The only caveat to that is, of course, those who are carbing up aggressively, like a rapid backload, or even moderately or linearly, whatever levels of glycogen you have now ascertained in your muscle tissue, that could be holding more water than other days of the week. And that's exactly why we're doing that. When you are using carbs to quote load, it is not the glycogen that makes your muscle tissue fuller. It's that glycogen attracts water into the muscle cells. So if you stop consuming water, you stop the ability of actually getting fuller. So I'll give you one example, just as a little bit of a turn in toward contest day now. One of my competitors last week who has a phenomenal physique. I mean, she could probably, depending on how full she is and glycogen levels, she could win in bikini, she could compete well in figure, and she could probably win in fit model. She just has a great physique, big, broad cap, delts, and, good quads, glutes, everything is there. But again, based on her fullness level, changes the game. So, competing primarily in bikini, she has a particular look, and she had a difficult time trusting me. Our first time working together this year. And when we were going through contest day, I could tell you're flat, you're flat, you're flat. Here's what we need to do. Where's your water? She just kind of went AWOL. She didn't want to talk about it. She had her mindset on what she wanted to do. So she ends up getting in 3 divisions, close second places, and then she sends me the photos after. And her arms and her shoulders are literally half the size as normal. And I said, "You were 100% dehydrated." I mean, her arms were small, and she's going to see this. We're going to probably have to have a talk and kind of work this out. But she knows, we've had these conversations, and she said, "Well, I was still hydrated from earlier in the week." I was still hydrated from earlier in the week. It just doesn't happen. That's not how physiology works, as we just described. So even though we had our carb plan in place and we were monitoring weight and everything was where it needed to be, the missing ingredient for her to be fuller, where she would have probably swept these 3 classes, was simply hydration. Um, Again, it's very, very hard, I know, for even our own clients to trust this, but maybe you have a good way of explaining that, Adam.
Like explaining like how to keep them
Well,
like
how like why on contest day do people still eschew water? Like, I just don't think that's going to work. And I'm sure you, as a coach, have to say, no, trust me, like, you got to get this much water in. We got to stay hydrated. Muscle tissues, 65, 70, 75% water. This is how we do it. How do you make sure they're going to have that buy-in and comply?
it's hard because I've had clients battle me on it for sure. Um, so the best way on how to get people to do it is sometimes maybe even test it prior to peak week. So I had a girl one time. I said, I want you to send me 2 sets of photos, one on Saturday dehydrated at noon and one hydrated at noon. And I said, I want you to put my eyes to the test and I'm going to pick which one you look better in. And it was the one with water. So, and she was like, you're good. And I said, I know. I said, but can you see the difference now? And she could. Now somebody has to be lean enough to see this, and I can't stress that enough. I think the reason we get into these myths is when judges, and I don't want to blame primarily the judges, but coaches say things like dry for show day, it does kind of hold that connotation that you shouldn't drink water, or, maybe a judge is too nice. You were holding water. Well, this is the first time you've ever seen this person's physique. How do you know that they're holding water? So I think testing can be, you know, helpful if someone's really hesitant about it. Also, just push the safety measures. But I also think, too, when people hear the word safety, they think this is an extreme sport. I don't want to be safe. And that almost makes it worse. But I had an interesting case with a guy at a nationals who, I felt like he nailed his peak on Friday. We were looking great, and he woke up Saturday, and I could not get him full. I couldn't get him to get a pump to save my life. And I just said, I really think you're dehydrated. And I kept giving him water. And I just so happened to have him test his blood sugar because I knew something was off. And he was usually like in the 70s, but he was like in the 130s. And it was because he finally told me when we confirmed that. He said, I didn't want to tell you, but I took a diuretic. And well, no wonder I can't keep you hydrated. You're just blowing through water. Now minerals. Also, I don't know what kind of diuretic you took. I had already added certain types of salt. I'm like, dude, I could have killed you because that's a really important thing for me to know. And it's just clients really need to understand like how important this is, and really be honest with your coach. I've had clients who we disagree on the water thing. If you want to go up there and not be your 100% best, and you're at least comfortable with that, let's start there, and maybe I can nudge you in that direction down the road.
Yeah, so organic chemistry 101, water follows solutes. You just mentioned minerals and carbohydrates, even with his blood sugar. I definitely want to take that turn because I want this to be very instructional for people. I don't want it just to be a warning to stay hydrated, because there are ways to stay hydrated effectively and productively to maintain your look and not spill over. Because to spill over, water is a component, but it's always driven by glucose, glycogen. So one more example. Also had a male client who said, man, I just feel like we blew this. Like my peak was shit. We need to go through this and figure out what happened. And I said, sure, send me every single photo you have from the day, all the different contexts of the day. We'll kind of backtrack forensically what you had eaten, what you had, had to drink through there, and we'll do it. And you know, lo and behold, he looked great. I mean, he is somebody whose body fat level isn't quite where I would like it to be, as you mentioned, Adam. And yet, all the way through contest day, even later in the day, his abs, his obliques, his low back were tighter than I had seen all the way through peak week. And yet, he was probably 15 to 20% flat. And so I said, again, let's talk about water. It looks like you were a little light on water. And he had slept in enough, which is fine. Sleep is always better than trying to force food on the day of a contest. But by the time he had, one and a half or two meals in, and it was time to get on stage, he had only had about 40 ounces of water. And I said, man, you were close. You weren't horribly flat. You were definitely super tight. And we always will wake up, as I said, from hydration levels tighter than any other time in the day. Flat, but tight. Everybody myopically looks at the best or the worst parts of their physique. And we always look at ourselves out of bed and say, man, look how tight I am. I need this on the, at the moment I'm on stage. And we just can't, because you're not horizontal for 8 hours before you get to the stage. You're not asleep. You're not withholding, food and so forth. But I said, man, we were so close. Maybe just 16 more ounces of water while you're pumping up would have, put you over the edge. So then you would have had your fullest look plus maintain this tightness. And to your point about a test pump up, I said, recall how many times I've mentioned to you while you're pumping up, if you're not getting that massive surge of fullness, if you're not seeing vascularity, then we're still underhydrated to some degree, especially if you're not spilling over, because that would indicate too much carbohydrate. But at the same time, to your point about holding water in muscle cells as you want, Adam, no matter how much hydration you're inducing backstage pumping up, maybe you need a little extra minerals. Certainly at that point in the ball game, glucose isn't going to help that much. So there are times to use just some kind of a mineral base along with that hydration. Sometimes just a hydration will work. But any thoughts on helping a client discern all three of those variables? Water backstage as they're warming up. Do I need a little extra carbohydrate? Do I need a little bit more sodium or just collective minerals like liquid IV, salt head, element, anything like that, Adam?
Yeah, so a lot of it comes down to your trends and photos. We should have established some really good consistency on how you look morning, midday, and night through your peak week. Um, and, and we know, like, from a client perspective, if I'm keeping your show day food a little bit lighter, we're going to super compensate in just the slightest form on show day. Not a lot, but I know by keeping the food lower, we're storing glycogen from the day prior. If you look like you were not as tight, it is usually a sodium or a water issue. And I always tell my clients if you can't get a pump, it's almost 1000% a sodium issue. So usually I'll have my clients pinch some more salt. We usually do it in pinches just because it's quick and easy. And then they usually find that they can get a pump within 20 minutes of that. And sometimes it can be you just need to dissipate with some heat, some activity. Um, and then the other thing with food, I think it just really depends on like when your last meal was. We should be working off some of that food, using that blood sugar for energy, through the contest day. You shouldn't be too active, on contest day, aside from pumping up. But, if you have some kind of panic or something like that, that could definitely make you hit that fight or flight response and you release a bunch of glucose into the bloodstream and start using it, you know, which can easily happen on show day, depending on the client and the situation. But a lot of times, a meal isn't going to replace that glycogen. You really want to lean on sodium and water as your drivers for contest day.
Yeah, so last week in your absence, I recorded a one-on-one coaching insight session on contest day carb management. And I realized you and I, over the years, have consistently reminded people that it takes 24 to 48 hours to fully assimilate glucose into glycogen, carbs you consume. In reality, what we're saying there is to fully assimilate. In other words, all of the muscle tissue in your body to get completely, fully stored levels of glycogen. As soon as you consume food and that glucose is hitting your bloodstream, some of it is starting to be assimilated into glycogen, but it does take hours and hours. And essentially, what you're doing on contest day to avoid spillover, because again, water follows solutes. Glucose is a solute, sodium is a solute, potassium is a solute. And you need those solutes to direct where hydration is going in your body, into cells or out of cells. There's a sodium, potassium ion gradient in cells and so forth, as we call that polarity. But when you are eating food on contest day, you are avoiding using stored glycogen. Because if I have worked for the last 2 or 3 days, or even progressively linearly loaded carbs to a fuller level, if I undereat on contest day, then I'm using some of that muscle glycogen. I'm going to urinate out more water that I'm consuming, and I'm going to get flat. That's what we're trying to protect. If I try to overfill my contest day with carbs, now I can't assimilate it fast enough. So there's extra glucose floating around, water follow solutes. It's not all going to be in the cells, and that's when we spill over. You get that, sometimes just morbidly soft look. It's devastating, for you to see, an hour prior, super, super tight lines in your abs, vascularity, wherever you kind of measure that metric in your own body. And then all of a sudden you look down and you're as soft as can be. That is because water has followed solutes out of the muscle cell. So you have to know the context. You used that phrase a few minutes ago. Knowing exactly what you've consumed, having it logically planned out because of how you're modeling it based off the last couple of days. With that knowledge in mind, you should be able to self-diagnose more easily. Here's what I look like, here's what I probably need. And I really do like your idea of that quick pump up test. If I do a set of push-ups, if I do some shoulder laterals, some curls, what am I really feeling? Is my muscle tissue responding or not? If I look too soft, go back just through your last few meals, your water compared to the last day. Where have you been? And I know you as a coach, that's your role. That's why you're saying all day long, send me photos. How are you feeling? How are you looking? Maybe as one final summary, talk about that interaction between how you as a coach are helping them monitor and assess that on contest day and how critical that communication is.
Yeah, so a lot of times it's funny because I'll have clients who want to try FaceTime me. It comes super pixelated. So we usually just use pictures and video, depending on the venue. Sometimes they'll be able to get video through, but usually I like to see them in their poses. I actually do like doing a pre-pump photo and post-pump photo because sometimes people can't really gauge how pumped they are. It kind of depends on the experience of the athlete as well. They've competed with me multiple times. I usually just say, let me know how that pump feels, and they're going to know what to look for. But we usually text from the moment they wake up, whether it be their makeup appointment. I woke up at 2 a.m. this week because there's a time change between Vegas and Kentucky was this past weekend. So, yeah, I mean, we're setting alarms and we're there for our clients. I actually schedule on my calendar about when they should be checking in because if they don't, something goes wrong. If they miss their morning check-in, I usually don't give it more than an hour or I'm calling them because what if they overslept and they need someone to wake them up? So, uh, I try to be as much of a coach as I can if I'm not there to make them feel like they're there. And honestly, I'm someone who used to go to a whole lot of shows, every show. I've actually found I can be a little bit more efficient with being really actively, readily available by my phone the entire contest day here. Sometimes shows can be kind of distracting. There's people wanting to chat with you and stuff, and it can be really nice to just have the data come in as you need it.
100%. That's a really good point because two things I want to give any competitor out there, your relationship with your coach. I as well, a couple big shows I would go to a year, but if I have 10 or 20 or 30 competitors competing and I'm at one particular contest, the conversations, this, that, you're just not hitting the communication. And almost like a command and control center. When I'm getting information, photos, video clips from clients, sometimes on two or three different screens, I'm pulling up our last couple days history and looking at that flow to help me differentially diagnose exactly where we are. So it is absolutely to a client's benefit sometimes to have their coach in that kind of a stable environment versus like, why aren't you at my contest like you were at so and so's contest? But the one thing I want to say, you can really impress your coach if you do one thing. If you're a viewer, listener of ours, um, communicate with your coach on contest day all day long and always give them the context. Hey, coach, here are my photos. I ate meal two 45 minutes ago. I've had this much water. I've had this much sodium. What would you like me to do? Hey, coach, I'm 45 minutes away from stage. I've had my third meal in at this time. Here, like always give that context without having to be asked because your coach can make much better, quicker reactions. I know that's what Adam and I rely on. That's how we can be most effective. But finally, if you have not done this, you need to go to YouTube as a platform because you want these visuals. Type in Contest Prep University Peak Intel Stage Hydration. You will see an hour-long video on stage hydration, including incredibly insightful photos of clients, just like Adam described. Here's this person as they woke up. Here they are 2 meals later. Here they are in the afternoon. Here they are before water, after water. You can see how dramatically different you look at different parts of a day, just completely based on hydration. Any final thoughts, Adam?
It's funny. I had an inquiry last week that I want to bring up, and she was trying to choose between me or another coach. And we jumped on our next call, and she said, I'm really thinking about going with this other team because even though my coach won't be at the show, they have someone who comes to the shows with me. And I said, well, that's cute. What do they do? Hold your bags? And she said, no, I think they actually like do my peak week. And I said, so you're going to have a coach who has never seen you until that contest day peak you? I said, does that sound like a really good idea? And she said, oh my God, you're right. I said, yeah, you should be having the trained eye of your coach peaking you on contest day. You don't want to turn it over to somebody last minute. And that sold her. And, I just kind of wanted to bring that up because that seems to be a common thing that I'm starting to see is another coach is there, peaking the athlete. And that's really not a good thing, actually.
Yeah, I mean there have been so many changes and evolutions in our industry since I started this almost 30 years ago, mid 90s. And some for better, some for worse. And even my coaching style has evolved, but I know from a commercial standpoint, I'm just competing against everybody else ad nauseum. It doesn't matter. You can make your own decisions. But I also certainly in a buyer beware sentiment, you know, I would want, for example, to make the best decision on technical skill, education, experience. And a lot of people do make decisions based on proximity. Well, this person's in my city. This person will go to this contest, and okay, I mean, give it a shot. But I certainly don't run around and try to beg people to coach with me, you, or anybody on our team. I just let our results stand for themselves and let people even vacillate from coach to coach and see what can hit the mark better than others. And a lot of times, even with my own clients, I have to admit, man, here's where we could be better. I know this was our first year. This was, we tried this, and here's what we're going to do for next time. It is a growing process. So wherever you land with a coach, if you think there was substantially good competency, you trust this person, they understand the physiology, don't be a one and done kind of person without giving a coach a shot, a second chance to improve. If you think logically and experientially, there's a reason. Sometimes it's just as important to say, no, this was a horrible experience. I got to move on. But Adam, I appreciate you as always jumping in with this with all of your experience. And again, if you guys will go to YouTube, type in Contest Prep University, Peak Intel, Stage Hydration, you will see all of this in action. And we will see you guys next time in Contest Prep.